Hey everybody, my name's Stephen Walker, also known as Axon Genesis, and the creator of the TimeFlow animation system for Unity. TimeFlow is a complete animation system and integrated timeline solution for Unity that works independently of or in combination with Unity's built-in timeline and Cinemachine and animation systems. In this video, I'd like to show you how to use TimeFlow to create cutscenes in your games or apps. To get started, we'll open up the Cutscenes demo, which is located in the Axon Genesis folder under TimeFlow, Examples, Scenes, Animation, Cutscenes. This is an already set up complete scene, which we'll enter play mode to demonstrate. So I can use the WASD controls on the keyboard to move this player character around, and as soon as it touches one of these pads, it invokes a cutscene animation and then returns control back to the player. Each one has a different animation that plays with a different camera position and animated item. There's also an option to skip, which quickly gets out of the cutscene. So we'll be going through the steps to create this from a basic scene. We'll go down to the tutorials folder and open up the starting cutscenes scene here. Now this scene, you'll notice it has no animation in it. There's no TimeFlow instances in it, but it has all the objects we need. The camera is set up with a basic, just as a basic rig here, which we'll be animating later. We also have our player controller with a simple player controller script on it, which just uses the keyboard input to translate the player. Next, we have some items which we'll be animating. Each of these corresponds to one of the pads. And then we have these triggers. Each one has a caps collider on it, set to is trigger. And we have some player positions, which will define the positions for each of our cutscenes, which we'll use later. And then our general environment and some UI elements. So the first thing I want to do is set up a new TimeFlow instance by clicking Add TimeFlow to the scene. And for this one, I'm going to move it to the top of the view here and rename it to Background. This is going to be our general animation for our main menu music and any ambient type animations you want going on. So for this, I'll click the Create Audio Track, which inserts a new game object with the audio track setup. And we can click on the audio clip to select the audio we want, which I want to use this TimeFlow menu. And viewing it here in the TimeFlow view, you can see the audio waveform. And if we play, we can hear the music in the background. All right. Next, I'm going to add an object just so we can see this TimeFlow animating visually. So add a basic cube. I'll move this up here into this group. And in the TimeFlow view, right click to add animation. And I'm going to let's add a tween and do transform local rotation Y. Set it to a duration of 4 bars, and we'll have it rotate a full 360 degrees in a single direction. And let's move this off here to the side. This is just an indicator so we can see that our animation is occurring seamlessly. Now, one thing I noticed is that the timeline here is kind of short, so let's go back to our audio track and click this button, Set TimeFlow Length. And this will automatically set the duration to match the full duration of the track. And we can reset this track here. So we have this cube just continually animating all the time. All right, so now we have this set up. We can collapse this group. Next, we want to add another TimeFlow instance to the scene. So go up to Tools, TimeFlow, Add TimeFlow. We can also move this up here to the top. And for this one, I want to set a duration of 60 seconds. And viewing it here, we can see now we have two different time flows. I want to rename this one also to Cutscenes. And then down here in the settings, let's choose a different color just so we can see it more clearly. and that will help us distinguish which time flow is active in the view. Next, we want to do is set up some regions to define our cutscenes. So the basic idea here is that this timeline is going to have each of our animated cutscenes in it separated out by time. So to create some time blocks, we'll use the markers in TimeFlow to designate some time regions. We can collapse this and go down to the markers. And we have this tool here to generate markers every number of seconds. And we can use a value of, let's say, 10 seconds. That should give us enough time to do each of our cutscenes. So we'll hit generate markers. And if we show the markers in the scene, we can see each of these colored markers has been placed in even increments. Another thing we can do is we can enable the tint checkbox, and holding the control key while clicking on it will enable it for all. And this is just as a helpful indicator for each of the different marker sections in the view. The first one is going just to be our startup. So this is going to be just our scene initialization process, and it doesn't necessarily have to have any animation. It's just some empty space for us to have a placeholder when the scene first initializes. The next one is going to be our cutscene 1, which we'll name as appropriate. And for this one, I'm going to set the color to orange, just because I like it to match each of the items it's relating to. Rather than have the cutscenes back to back, we want to add a little bit of time between them. So I'm going to add another marker here. It's going to be the end of cutscene 1. And we can just make this sort of a neutral gray color. So this is just sort of dead space. So our first cutscene is going to be this orange area here. Then for the next one, we'll set up cutscene 2 and N2, and then cutscene 3. And I'm going to add one more marker down here, set the time to, let's say, 56 seconds. And we're going to name this N3, and we can resort these markers by time so they're all in order. Very good. So we have all these, and let's just set these colors up a bit more to match our pattern. Make this one blue and this one gray. All right, now another thing I'd like to do is turn on this checkbox for each of our cutscenes to display the label in the TimeFlow view. Another helpful trick is you can double click on any of the markers to frame it in the view, or you can use these arrow keys to jump through each of the different marker sections. There's also this drop-down menu, which you can jump to a specific one or see the full duration. Now that we have our markers set up, the next thing we want to do is add some animation. So in this scene, we're going to animate the camera, the player, and the items. So I'm going to grab these 3 objects and add them to the cutscenes group. It is important whenever you have multiple TimeFlow instances in the same scene that you group items so that they know which TimeFlow animation system they belong to. This is also just a helpful way to keep your scene organized. So with our camera selected, we're going to just drag and drop that into the view, and then right-click on it to select Add Animation, Blend. Blend is a helpful tool that basically allows you to animate between different sets of positions and any number of properties, and it's really helpful for creating camera animations where you can create a set for each of the different camera views and then smoothly animate between them. In this case, we're going to animate the camera object, the parent object here. And that's all the setup we need to do here. And then if we go over to the sets, we can click Capture Set to capture the current viewpoint. This captures the transform position and rotation. This is good for our startup. This is going to be our default gameplay game view. And then we're going to want to create a different set for each of the different viewpoints that relate to each of these different pads to do a sort of a zoom in for each of the cutscenes. So we'll go ahead and duplicate this. We'll name this cutscene 1. And you'll notice that if you move these, it directly affects the object. I already had some values that I wanted to enter. So that frames nicely this orange pad in our frame here for cutscene 1. I'm going to duplicate this and name this cutscene 2. And again, enter the coordinates for this one. And of course, you can always come back and adjust these later. We're just sort of blocking things in right now. And then duplicate this to make cutscene 3. Great, so we have each of these set up so we can click done. And now if we click these buttons at the top, we can cycle through each of these different camera views. However, what we want to do in the case of these cutscenes is animate between these views. So back in the time flow view, we'll start by adding a keyframe at the very beginning. And this keyframe we'll set to the startup. This will be our initialization keyframe. And then if we jump over to the cutscene 1, we'll add another keyframe. And this one will turn off the hold option and animate from the startup to the cutscene 1 and check off auto to enter a specific duration of, let's say, 2 seconds. So if we preview this right now, we can see, yep, it animates over a 2-second period into that position. But then we'll also want to hold for a couple of seconds and then add another keyframe, which we can hold Control and drag and duplicate this and reverse the order so it goes from the cutscene 1 back to the startup. So we have this hold section, and then it animates the outro. Now we have this extra dead time here after this cutscene, which we want to shore up. So we'll just move this end marker, holding the Alt key to snap it to the end. So now this will be our first cutscene, just like that. Great, now we have that done. I'm going to copy these keyframes and jump to the next cutscene and paste these in here and change it to cutscene 2. Let's just preview that. Perfect. And once again, we'll drag the end marker here just to shore things up so we have a nice outro point. Copy these keyframes and jump to the next. Paste them in here again, and we'll change this to cutscene 3 and just a preview. Great, so those are our camera animations, which we can see again, we have cutscene 1, 2, and 3. Now, if we play the scene right now, nothing's going to happen because these have not yet been set up with any triggers. So it's just going to play through that animation. And what we want to do is when the character touches any of these pads, that it will play the appropriate cutscene. So in order to do that, we'll want to set up our interactive controller. So selecting the cutscenes time flow object, we'll go to Tools, Time Flow, Add Time Flow Controller. Now the Time Flow Controller is a basic script that provides a nice interface for managing time flow playback at runtime. And this will just help us simplify the setup and add additional logic using Unity events. So each of these boxes here, we can add events. So to set up our triggers to work with the Time Flow Controller, we'll take a look at each of these. And again, each trigger is basically just a collider with a rigid body, and it has the simple script on it, the trigger event script, which provides an on-trigger enter call with a Unity event. And of course, you can use your own scripts or your own triggers to do this. But for this first one here, this trigger event, we'll drag in the Time Flow Controller and then select from the Time Flow Controller, play from marker, and we'll type in the name of our marker we want to play from. So cutscene 1. And we'll repeat this for each of the others. Go from play from marker, cutscene 2. And again, play from marker, cutscene 3. So we have each of these triggers set up. So now if I enter play mode, we should see those each time the player touches one of these pads. So let's try it. Yep, we have our cutscene playing. You notice though that while the cutscene is playing, I can still move the character around, which is maybe not what we want to do because it can keep re-triggering each of these different areas. So we'll fix that next. Back in our TimeFlow controller, we have these additional Unity events on startup, on play, on stop, and on skip. So we're going to add events to each of these. And we're going to drag in our player. And what we want to do is for each one, we want to set the simple player controller enabled state. So on startup, we definitely want the player controller to be enabled. But then on play, when the TimeFlow controller starts playing back a cutscene, we want it to be off. So we'll leave this unchecked. And then when it stops, we want to return control back to the player. And for the skip event, we can ignore that for right now. So we have that on our player controller. Another thing we want to do is we have this skip button, which we want to hook in. So I'm going to add some additional events here. And looking down in here in our UI, we have our skip button. I'm going to assign that to each of these events. And for this one, I want to use the game object set active so that it's fully activated or deactivated. All right, so that on startup, we want to turn the skip button off. When it starts playing a cutscene, we want to show the skip button. We'll turn that on. And then on stop, we're going to turn it off again. And also, if the player presses the skip button, we want the skip button to also be hidden. So we'll leave that off there. And then the skip button has not been hooked into the controller yet. So we'll go ahead and assign the TimeFlow controller and select the method skip. Great, so let's go ahead and play the scene and test this out so far. So on startup, we can see that the skip button is hidden. And if we move the player over, yep, the skip button shows up. And then I can't move the player while it's in the cutscene. And again, I can't move the player, but I can press the skip button and it fast forwards to the end. You'll notice that when I press the skip button, the time jumps to 2 seconds before the ending, and that's controlled here in the TimeFlow controller by this skip duration. If you set the skip duration, let's say to 0, and then skip, it'll just cut right back. Though it's often nice to have a little bit of an outro animation, so I'm putting a 2-second padded duration here. So again, skip, great. But the next thing we want to do is I'd like to move the player into the center of the pad each time it plays the cutscene, rather than it just stopping wherever it touches. All right, so to do that, we're going to add our player object to the TimeFlow view. And for this, we're going to use a follow behavior, which is under add automation, follow. And what follow does is basically it's used to move an object to a target position or to another target transform. We're going to be animating this, however, so that it will work dynamically just during our cutscenes and otherwise not interfere with the player movement. On the player, we'll right-click to add a couple other animation channels. The first channel we want to add is the follow player object to follow. And then right-click again, we'll add another animation for the follow player overall blend. I'm just going to reorder these a little bit. Great, so I'm going to open up the values column here just so we can see what's going on a little bit better. So at the very beginning here, I'm going to set an initial keyframe on both of these channels. And I want the player start position to be this transform here, this player position start. So we have this keyframe here setting this initial follow position. But we can step now through to the cutscene 1, and again set keyframes on both of these. But for this one, I want to use player position 1. And I want to animate the overall blend from 0 to 1. So I'm going to move this keyframe out, maybe let's say 2 seconds. And then add add another keyframe here starting from 0. And if we jump over into the graph view, you can see this a little better. So that as this cutscene plays, it will animate the character position from wherever it's starting to the final position. And then we'll want to do the same outro, returning it back, just copying and pasting these keyframes so we have this nice curve here. We won't be able to fully see this, preview this until we enter play mode. But now that we have these keyframes set up, we can replicate this to the others by selecting and copying them and jumping to the next cutscene and Control V to paste. And then for this keyframe, we will set it to player position 2. And then jump to the next one, paste again, and this one will be player position 3. So we have each of these positions, and we will see a little bit of a preview that the player is now in the right position for each of these. We can enter play mode to test it out. And now if we move to any one of these pads, it triggers the cutscene and the player is moved to the position. Now that we have that set up, next we want to add some additional animations to work with each of these different items to do some sort of reveal so that they're not just sitting there. So I'll grab all 3 of these items and I'm going to hit Alt tilde to add them to the view. And we can jump to cutscene 1 and set up our first item. I'm just going to sort the view here so these items in order. So we have item 1, 2, and 3. And I'm going to put a color for each one of these just so we can have a nice visual cue to relate them to the specific areas. So with item 1, we're going to select the track and then right click to select tracks, set track to work area. And for each of these items, I'm going to select all 3. I'm going to set them to the activate mode. What this means is that the game objects will only be active during the cutscene animation, and otherwise they'll be disabled. So selecting item 2, we can go to cutscene 2. And again, right click on the track to set track to work area. And then we'll do the same thing with cutscene 3. And if we jump out to view the full duration, we can see that we have the items now, each corresponding to their cutscene. But I want to add some additional animations. So let's go back to cutscene 1. And on item 1, I'm going to right click and add animation channel transform. We want to animate the local scale, uniform value. Set some keyframes here. I want to animate from 0 to 1. We can look in the graph view just to kind of see what we're doing a little better. And copy this keyframe and our end keyframe again. Like that. One helpful thing too, you might notice if you accidentally drag some markers while you're working, if you select any marker and then control click on the lock icon, but you can't drag or modify them. So this is helpful just to prevent editing them while you're working in the view. So we have our scale. And I also want to add some rotation to this. So I'm going to right click again, add animation channel, local rotation Y. And for this one, we'll set a start keyframe of 0 and an end keyframe of 360. And I would like this one to be a linear animation, just so it's just a constant rotation. And then one more thing I want to add here is a animation channel to animate the Y position. So we'll start from 0. And we'll animate it up to, let's say, 3 units, and then back down to 0. So we have this nice curve here. So let's just preview that. Great. Now I'd like to make this a little snappier, so I'm going to duplicate this keyframe, move it out here and over here like that, just so it snaps up a little bit faster. All right, I like that. So now I want to replicate this animation to each of the other items. And an easy way to do that is to select each of these channels and then simply drag them to the next item. Then if we select these keyframes and zoom out, we can hold the Alt key and drag to snap them to the next cutscene. And then we can replicate this again, going to the final cutscene. And if we just play these to preview it, so we have cutscene 1, cutscene 2, and then our final cutscene 3. Of course, you can add additional animations to this. This is just a starting point, but basically following the same process, you can add any number of items to each of these different regions, and you can animate the same objects, such as characters, dialogue, anything that helps you to tell your story. So let's go ahead and just preview this now that we have this set up and see where we're at. So the objects are not visible, and as soon as I touch one of these things, the player moves in position, the item is revealed. Perfect, it's exactly what we wanted it to do. And of course we can hit skip if we want to fast forward, and we'll just test the last one. There you have it. That concludes this video on creating cutscenes with TimeFlow. I hope it's been informative. Of course, feel free to ask questions and write your comments down below. Also, get in touch on the Unity forum. I'm constantly checking that. And I'd love to get your feedback and input on TimeFlow overall. If there's any additional videos you'd like to see, I'd love to hear that too. If you enjoyed this content, please hit the like and subscribe button and hit the notification bell to be notified of future videos. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.